There's a question that hides underneath a lot of suffering, and most people never quite say it out loud. Why keep going? Not necessarily as a dramatic crisis. Sometimes it's quieter than that. The ordinary exhaustion of getting through another difficult stretch, illness, loss, failure, the slow grind of disappointment, and somewhere underneath the coping, the question sits there, unspoken. What is any of this actually for? Most people push the question away. It feels dangerous to ask directly, so they keep moving, keep managing, keep functioning without ever really answering it. A man named Viktor Frankl was forced to answer it in the worst possible circumstances anyone could imagine. He was a psychiatrist in Vienna before the Second World War. Then he was taken to Auschwitz. He lost his wife, his parents, almost his entire family in the camps. He lived through years of conditions designed to strip away every shred of dignity a person could have. And in the middle of that, in conditions that should have made the question of why keep going feel almost absurd to even ask, he found an answer, not a comforting platitude, something he tested against the most extreme suffering a human being can experience, and that held up. He discovered that meaning isn't something that happens to you when life is good. It's something you can create even when everything has been taken from you. And that discovery changed how an entire field of psychology thinks about suffering. Let me tell you what he actually noticed, because it wasn't abstract philosophy. It came from direct, brutal observation. In the camps, surrounded by death, starvation, and degradation that most of us can barely imagine, Frankl noticed something unexpected. Survival wasn't simply about physical strength. Some physically strong men gave up and died quickly. Some physically weaker men endured far longer than anyone expected. What seemed to separate them wasn't the body. It was something else. The men who held on to some reason to keep going, a person waiting for them outside, an unfinished piece of work, a belief they refused to abandon, even just the determination to bear witness to what was happening so the world would eventually know. Those men were more likely to survive. Not because meaning protected them from the physical horror, it didn't. The conditions were brutal regardless of what anyone believed, but meaning gave them something to organize their suffering around. A reason the suffering was happening to someone, to a person with a future, a purpose, a reason to endure today in order to reach tomorrow, rather than suffering that was simply happening, pointless and endless, to no one in particular. Frankl wrote something that has stayed with people for decades since. Those who have a why to live for can bear almost any how. This wasn't a theory he developed in comfort and then applied to suffering from a safe distance. He developed it while he was the one suffering, while he was the one asking every single day whether there was any reason to keep going. I want to be careful here, because this idea gets flattened sometimes into something it isn't. Frankl wasn't saying that suffering is good. He wasn't saying that pain is secretly a gift, or that you should be grateful for hardship, or any of the things that toxic positivity tends to insist on. He was saying something more precise and I think more useful. Suffering is going to happen to everyone in some form, regardless of how carefully they live or how much they try to avoid it. That's simply the condition of being alive. The question isn't whether you'll suffer. It's what you'll do with the suffering once it arrives. And he found, through the most extreme possible test of this idea, that human beings have a specific capacity that can't be taken away by external circumstances, no matter how severe those circumstances become. The capacity to choose your attitude toward what's happening to you. Not the capacity to control what happens. The camps proved brutally that control over circumstances can be stripped away entirely, but the inner response, the meaning you make of what's happening, the stance you take toward your own suffering, that remained even when everything else was taken. He called this the last human freedom, the freedom that exists even when every other freedom has been removed. I want to make this practical because most people reading this aren't in a concentration camp, and the lessons need to translate to ordinary suffering for them to matter. Think about a loss you've experienced, not necessarily the most extreme loss of your life, any loss that genuinely hurt. There's the loss itself, which you can't undo. The thing or person is gone. That part is fixed, finished, outside your control. But there's a second layer, which is what you make of the loss. Whether you experience it as pure waste, something that simply happened to you, meaningless, destructive, with nothing redeemable in it, or whether you find, even in the middle of real pain, some thread of meaning. A way the loss connects to something you value, a way it changes how you live going forward, a way it deepens your capacity to understand other people who are suffering similarly. Both responses involve the same external event. The loss is identical either way. What differs is the inner relationship to it. Frankl's discovery was that this inner relationship, small as it might seem compared to the scale of the actual suffering, is not a minor detail. It's often the entire difference between a person who is destroyed by their pain and a person who is, in some genuine sense, made deeper by it. Not because the pain itself was good, because of what they did with it. This is the conversation that matters most when things are genuinely hard. If it's reaching you, subscribe. We go here every week. Let me talk about where meaning actually comes from, because Frankl was specific about this, and it's more practical than people expect. He identified three main sources. The first is through work. Through doing something, creating something, contributing something that matters to you. This doesn't have to be grand. It can be raising a child well. It can be a craft you've spent years developing. It can be showing up reliably for people who depend on you. The scale doesn't determine the meaning. What matters is that you're genuinely engaged in something beyond simply passing time. The second is through love, through genuinely caring about another person and being cared about in turn. Frankl wrote about this from direct experience. In the camps, separated from his wife, not knowing if she was alive, he found that simply holding her image in his mind, the memory of her, the love he felt for her, gave him a reason to endure a day he might otherwise not have survived. The love itself, even without her physical presence, was a source of meaning powerful enough to matter in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. The third source is the one most people miss, and it's the one most relevant to ordinary suffering, meaning through the stance you take toward unavoidable pain. When you can't change what's happening to you, when the suffering simply has to be endured because there's no alternative, you can still choose how you carry it. With bitterness, or with a kind of dignity that refuses to let the suffering be the only thing that defines you. With resignation, or with an active decision about what the suffering will mean for who you become. This third source is the most radical part of Frankl's discovery, because it means meaning is available even in situations where the first two sources, meaningful work, meaningful love, aren't currently accessible. Even when you've lost everything else, this kind of meaning remains available. I want to talk about something that doesn't get said enough in conversations about meaning: the difference between meaning and happiness. Our culture has largely collapsed these into the same thing. We assume that a meaningful life is a happy one, and that if you're not happy, something has gone wrong with your search for meaning. Frankl thought this was backward, and his own life is strong evidence for why. He experienced some of the deepest meaning of his life during some of the worst suffering any human being has endured. Not because the suffering was pleasant, it wasn't, not for a single moment, but because meaning and happiness are actually different things, responding to different conditions. Happiness tends to depend on circumstances. It rises and falls with what's happening to you, how comfortable your situation is, whether things are going well. Meaning is more durable. It can exist even in circumstances that produce no happiness whatsoever. A parent staying up all night with a sick child isn't happy in that moment by any reasonable definition, but the act is saturated with meaning. A person enduring chemotherapy isn't happy during treatment, but many people describe finding profound meaning during illness, in their relationships, in their reordered priorities, in what the experience teaches them about what actually matters. If you've been chasing happiness directly, and feeling like a failure every time life gets hard, this distinction matters enormously. You're not failing at happiness. You might simply be encountering one of the many situations in human life where happiness isn't currently available, but meaning still is. And meaning, Frankl would argue, is actually the deeper and more sustaining of the two. People can endure enormous unhappiness if they have meaning. Very few people can sustain genuine well-being for long if their life feels meaningless, no matter how comfortable their circumstances. I want to address something that comes up immediately whenever this topic is discussed: the fear of being told to simply find a silver lining. That's not what Frankl was describing, and I want to be precise about the difference. A silver lining is a forced positive reframe, insisting that something bad was actually secretly good, minimizing the real cost of what happened, performing optimism because that's what's expected. Frankl wasn't asking anyone to pretend their suffering wasn't real or wasn't bad. He lost his wife, his parents, most of his family, years of his life. He never minimized any of that. He never suggested the Holocaust was secretly a blessing in disguise, or that there was some hidden silver lining to genocide. What he was describing is different, and I think much more honest. The suffering is real and bad, full stop. And separately, you have a capacity, limited but real, to decide what you do with the fact that it happened. Not to make it good, to make something of your own life in response to it. This is meaning emerging despite suffering, not suffering magically transforming into something good. The distinction matters because the second version is dishonest, and the first version is actually survivable for most people in a way the second version eventually is not. You can't sustain the lie that something terrible was secretly fine. You can sustain the harder, more honest truth that something terrible happened, and you're still responsible for what you do with the rest of your life. Let me talk about a specific pattern Frankl noticed that's relevant to anyone going through prolonged difficulty, not just the kind of acute crisis the camps represented. He observed that people who survived longest in extremely difficult conditions often had something specific, a future orientation, something to look forward to, a reason the present suffering connected to a future that mattered. This wasn't naive optimism, believing things would definitely turn out fine. Many of the men Frankl observed had no rational basis for optimism about their actual circumstances. The future orientation was more specific than that. It was having something, a person, a project, a piece of unfinished work, that gave today's endurance a reason beyond simply surviving today for its own sake. He noticed the opposite pattern too, and it was instructive. Men who lost this future orientation, who stopped believing there was anything ahead worth enduring toward, tended to decline rapidly, even when their physical circumstances hadn't changed. The loss of meaning preceded and seemed to accelerate physical collapse. This has obvious relevance beyond extreme circumstances. People going through prolonged ordinary difficulty, a long illness, a difficult divorce, an extended period of unemployment, grief that doesn't resolve quickly, often experience something similar. The suffering itself is hard, but what makes it unbearable is often the added layer of feeling like there's nothing on the other side of it worth enduring toward. Finding or rebuilding that future orientation, even something modest, even something that feels almost too small to count as a real reason, can be the difference between suffering that breaks you and suffering that, while genuinely hard, doesn't take everything with it. I want to talk about what Frankl called the existential vacuum, because I think it describes something extremely common in modern life, even among people who aren't dealing with acute suffering at all. He noticed, in his work after the war, a different kind of suffering becoming increasingly common. Not the suffering of obvious deprivation, but the suffering of people who had everything they needed materially and still felt a persistent emptiness. He attributed this to a lack of meaning, not because these people's lives were objectively difficult, but because they'd never engaged with the question of what their life was actually for. They'd been busy, productive, successful by external measures, and quietly hollow underneath all of it. This is worth sitting with because it suggests that meaning isn't only relevant during crisis. It's something that needs ongoing attention even, maybe especially, when things are going fine on the surface. The existential vacuum doesn't always feel dramatic. It often feels like low-grade boredom, restlessness, a sense that something is missing without being able to name exactly what. People try to fill it with more achievement, more entertainment, more stimulation, and find that none of it actually addresses the underlying absence, because the absence isn't a lack of activity. It's a lack of genuine engagement with the question of meaning. Frankl's insight here is that this vacuum isn't solved by avoiding hard questions. It's solved by actually asking them. What do I want my life to be about? What am I actually contributing to, caring about, building? Not abstractly, specifically in the actual texture of how the days are spent. Most people avoid this question because it's uncomfortable, but avoiding it doesn't make the vacuum go away. It just makes it chronic, quiet, and easy to mistake for simply how life is. I want to talk about something specific Frankl noticed about the people around him in the camps that has direct relevance to ordinary life: the danger of comparing your suffering to others. It would have been easy in that environment for prisoners to rank suffering against each other, to feel that their own pain didn't count because someone else had it worse, or to become consumed by resentment that someone else seemed to have it slightly easier. Frankl noticed that this comparison, when it happened, tended to corrode rather than help. It either minimized a person's own genuine suffering to the point where they stopped taking it seriously, or it fed a bitterness that made the suffering harder to bear without adding anything useful. This is worth bringing into ordinary life because the comparison instinct shows up constantly outside of extreme circumstances too. People minimize their own genuine difficulty because someone else, somewhere, has it worse, as if suffering only counts above some threshold of severity. Or they become bitter watching people whose lives look easier, as if the unfairness of that comparison adds something useful to their own situation. Frankl's approach was different. He treated suffering as something to be engaged with on its own terms, regardless of how it compared to anyone else's. Your suffering doesn't need to be the worst suffering in the world to be worth taking seriously, and it doesn't become more bearable by being ranked against someone else's pain. The question was never, is my suffering bad enough to count? It was, given that this is happening to me, what do I do with it? That reframe alone removes a significant amount of unnecessary additional suffering. The suffering of feeling like you don't have the right to your own pain, which is its own kind of burden layered on top of whatever the original difficulty already was. Let me talk about something Frankl wrote about that often gets skipped over: the specific role of dignity, separate from outcome. He observed that some of the men in the camps who had the least control over anything, who were going to suffer terribly and quite possibly die regardless of anything they did, still made choices about how they carried themselves. Whether they shared what little they had, whether they spoke to others with some remaining kindness, even in circumstances designed to strip every form of decency away. These choices didn't change the external outcome in most cases. The dignity didn't save anyone from the gas chambers. Frankl was unflinching about this. He wasn't suggesting that virtue produces a happy ending, but he insisted that the choice mattered anyway, not because of its effect on survival, but because of what it meant about the person making it. Even stripped of every other freedom, of every form of control over their own fate, these men retained the capacity to decide what kind of person they were going to be in their remaining time. This matters for ordinary suffering because we often unconsciously evaluate whether something is worth doing based on whether it changes the outcome. If dignity doesn't save you, why bother? If kindness doesn't fix the situation, what's the point? Frankl's answer was that the point isn't always the outcome. Sometimes the point is simply who you become, regardless of outcome. A person who responds to their suffering with integrity is a different person, has lived a different inner life, than someone who responds to identical suffering by abandoning every value they held, even if the external circumstances turn out exactly the same for both of them. This is a harder standard than most people want to apply to their own lives, because it removes the comfort of, it doesn't matter how I handle this since the outcome will be the same either way. Frankl's discovery suggests that it does matter, not for the outcome, for you. I want to talk about something practical. How you actually find meaning when you're in the middle of something hard, rather than looking back at it after the fact with the clarity that distance provides. This is harder than it sounds, because most discussions of meaning happen retrospectively. Someone survives something terrible, and years later, with hindsight and healing and distance, they can describe what it taught them, how it changed them, what meaning emerged from it. That's genuinely valuable, but it's a different exercise than finding meaning while you're still inside the suffering, with no guarantee of how it resolves, no hindsight available yet, no way of knowing whether there's a redemptive ending coming. Frankl was specific about this, because he developed his ideas while still inside the worst of it, not after. And what he found useful in the moment, rather than only in retrospect, was smaller and more immediate than the grand narratives that come later. It was the decision to focus on what was still possible, however limited, rather than dwelling entirely on what had been lost. In the camps, this might mean noticing a small kindness from another prisoner, or finding a moment of genuine connection even amid horror, or holding on to a memory of someone loved as a source of strength, rather than only as a source of grief. In ordinary suffering, this translates to something achievable, rather than only asking what has been taken from me, also asking what is still here. What can I still do today, in however limited a way, that connects to something I care about? Who can I still show up for, even partially, even imperfectly? What small piece of meaning is available right now, in this specific day, rather than waiting for the entire situation to resolve before meaning becomes accessible? This isn't about denying the severity of what's happening. The loss is real, the difficulty is real, and pretending otherwise doesn't help. It's about refusing to let the full scope of the suffering eclipse every remaining possibility for meaning, even small ones, even temporary ones, even ones that don't undo or excuse what's happened. Meaning found this way tends to be modest, a single conversation that mattered, a small act of care extended or received, a moment of genuine presence with someone, even inside a day otherwise defined by difficulty. These don't resolve the larger suffering, but they prevent the larger suffering from being the only thing that's real in a given day. I want to say something about the relationship between meaning and time, because it changes how this entire conversation should be approached. Meaning isn't usually available all at once, fully formed the moment you ask for it. It tends to accumulate, built from small, specific engagements with what's actually in front of you, rather than from one large insight that resolves everything permanently. This matters because people often expect meaning to arrive the way clarity arrives in a movie, a single moment of realization that changes everything from that point forward. When that moment doesn't come, when the suffering continues without any dramatic insight resolving it, people sometimes conclude that meaning simply isn't available to them in this situation. But Frankl's own experience suggests something different. The meaning he found in the camps wasn't a single revelation. It was built day by day, decision by decision, through small acts of choosing how to respond to what was happening, repeated over an extended and brutal period of time. This is more demanding than waiting for a single insight, but it's also more honest about how meaning actually tends to work. It's less like discovering a hidden treasure, and more like slowly building something with the materials you have, in conditions you didn't choose. If you're in the middle of something hard right now and feeling like meaning hasn't arrived yet, the absence of a dramatic insight doesn't mean meaning isn't available. It might just mean you're still in the early stages of building it, one small choice at a time, the way most meaningful things actually get built. I want to talk about what happened to Frankl after the camps were liberated, because it tells you something important about whether this entire framework actually holds up once the extreme crisis is over. He could have spent the rest of his life consumed by the loss. He had every justification for it. His wife was dead. His parents were dead. Most of his family had been murdered. He had lived through years of degradation that most people can barely imagine, let alone endure. Instead, he went back to work almost immediately. He wrote the book that would eventually become known to millions of readers, describing what he'd witnessed and what he'd learned about meaning under the most extreme conditions. He returned to clinical practice. He developed his approach into a full therapeutic method, eventually called Logotherapy, built around the idea that the search for meaning is the primary human motivation, more fundamental even than the search for pleasure or power. He lived for decades after the war, continuing to work, continuing to write, continuing to teach. He didn't simply survive the camps and then quietly carry the trauma for the rest of his life, separate from everything else he did. The meaning he discovered there became the foundation for the rest of his life's work. This matters because it demonstrates something important. The discovery wasn't a coping mechanism that only worked inside the crisis and then became irrelevant once the crisis ended. It was a genuine insight about how human beings function, one that held up not just during the worst possible circumstances, but for the decades of ordinary life that followed. If meaning were only a survival strategy for extreme suffering, something you reach for in crisis and then discard once things improve, it would be a much smaller discovery than what Frankl actually offered. What he demonstrated by how he lived the rest of his life is that the orientation toward meaning isn't just for emergencies. It's a way of engaging with existence generally, useful in the camps and equally useful in different forms, in the ordinary difficulties and ordinary stretches of a full life afterward. This is part of why his work has remained relevant for so long, well beyond the specific historical horror that occasioned it. The insight scales. It applies to grief, to chronic illness, to professional disappointment, to the ordinary boredom of an unexamined life, as much as it applied to the camps, even though the severity of these situations is obviously not comparable. The mechanism is the same. Ask what this moment, however difficult, asks of you. Engage with whatever meaning is actually available, however modest. Take responsibility for what you make of your own suffering, rather than waiting for circumstances to hand you relief before you're willing to engage with the question at all. I want to close with something about responsibility, because it's the part of Frankl's thinking that I think is most actionable. He believed that meaning isn't handed to you. It's not waiting somewhere to be discovered, fully formed, if you just look hard enough. It's something you're responsible for creating in the actual circumstances of your actual life, including the parts of those circumstances you didn't choose and can't change. This is both harder and more empowering than the alternative. Harder because it means there's no one to blame for an unexamined life except the person living it. No external rescue is coming to hand you meaning fully assembled, but empowering because it means meaning is available regardless of your circumstances. Not equally easy to access in every situation, Frankl never claimed otherwise, but available, even in the camps, even in grief, even in ordinary boredom and disappointment. The conditions for meaning are not about having an easy life. They're about engaging honestly with whatever life you actually have. This is, I think, the most important thing to take from his discovery. Not a formula, not a guarantee that things will feel okay if you just think about them the right way. A responsibility, the responsibility to ask, in whatever circumstances you're actually in, what does this require of me? What can I contribute even here? What relationship, what work, what stance toward my own suffering would make this chapter of my life mean something rather than simply pass? That question doesn't remove the suffering. Frankl was clear about that, more clear than almost anyone who has written about resilience. The camps were not made bearable by meaning. They remained brutal, regardless of what anyone believed. But the question changes what the suffering does to you, whether it simply happens to you, meaninglessly, or whether you become someone specific in how you respond to it. That choice, small as it sometimes feels against the scale of what's happening, was, for Frankl, the entire difference. One last thought. You don't need to wait for a crisis the size of his to take this seriously. The discovery he made under the worst conditions imaginable applies just as much to the ordinary, undramatic difficulties of an actual life. The disappointment that hasn't resolved, the grief that's still unfolding, the boredom that's been quietly accumulating for years. The same question applies. What does this require of me? What's still possible, even here? What would it mean to engage with this honestly instead of waiting for it to simply pass? That question is available to you right now, in whatever you're actually facing, however large or small it seems by comparison to what Frankl endured. It was always the size of the question that mattered, not the size of the suffering it was asked inside of. That's the discovery, made in darkness, true in light. For the comments, what's one piece of suffering in your life that you've never quite asked what it might mean? You don't need an answer yet. Just naming the question is the beginning. I'll see you in the next one.